Good morning, everyone. This is Father Nate, missionary priest in Italy, and thanks for joining us today, January 7th, on No Greater Delight, our podcast on Marian feasts and Marian meditations. Well, as always, we have a number of feasts to celebrate today, some very interesting ones, in fact. So first up, we'll go to Guadalajara in Jalisco, Mexico, where they celebrate Nuestra Señora de Guadalupe. You might be thinking, well, we didn't celebrate her in December, right? December 12th? Yes, but there are certain events regarding this particular church that take place on January 7th. So it was 6 years after he became the Bishop of Guadalajara that Fray Antonio Alcalde founded the Shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe in what was at the time sort of a sparsely populated area on the north side of Guadalajara, Jalisco. The first stone of this Church of Our Lady was laid on January 7th, 1777. 4 years later, on January 7th, 1781, the completed church was consecrated. Now, not only did Bishop Alcalde fund the construction himself, but he also built low-rent housing for the poor in the shrine's neighborhood. And that grew quickly and became one of the main districts of the city. As you can imagine, December 12th, there is a huge celebration here. Next up, we'll jump over to Santissima Pietà, on the celebration of Santissima Pietà, in Cannobio, Verbano, Cusio, Ossola, in Piedmont, Italy. So there is a night procession that commemorates the bleeding of a fresco in 1522, right? So this happens on the night of the 7th, and then the following days, like the Mass and procession, like the actual day of the feast, is January 8th. So what is this about, the Santissima Pietà? Well, it is a small painting on parchment, and what it has is Christ in Pietà, meaning like, in death, with Mary and John the Evangelist next to him, right? So what happened is in 1522, on January 8th, 9th, 10th, and 28th, and then February 4th and 27th, again, we're talking 1522, the parchment bled, right? So that means that the wounds of Jesus' body came alive, right? And drops of blood came out from them, right? Which actually bled onto the mantle below. Now, the second evening, January 9th, a small bloody rib, which was like the size of Christ in the painting, came out from the wounded side where Mary was, like where her hand is in the picture, right? And that little bit of rib fell out onto the table that was below the picture, right? It was gathered up and put in a chalice and carried in procession to the parish church, where it is kept even today in a precious reliquary given by Cardinal Borromeo in 1605. The claws that were stained with blood are in an urn that is on the table of the high altar in the sanctuary. Likewise, there's a devotion to Our Lady of Egypt, because the tradition says that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus returned home from Egypt to Israel on this day. And last, but certainly not least, we celebrate Madonna delle Grazie di Folgaria, right? You're like, well, what is that? Interestingly enough, she is the patroness and principal patroness of all the skiers in Italy. Yes, you heard that right. The patroness of all the skiers in Italy, the people who ski like down the mountain. And that's because Pius XII, on January 7th, 1955, issued a papal bull wherein he declared the Madonna of Graces of Folgaria as their patroness. So what is the Madonna delle Grazie di Folgaria? Well, it's a shrine that's up in the mountains, right? It traces its devotion or its existence to the monk Pietro dal Dosso, right? During an ecstasy in January of 1588, he received an order to go back to his native place and to build a chapel in her honor, right? And he was told to do so in a field that he owned in Ecken, which is about a kilometer outside of Folgaria. Okay, so what did he do? Well, he was a monk, so he asked permission, and he said, okay. He asked for permission to go, and in 1588, he received that permission. He went back to his native place, and he encouraged all of his fellow citizens there to build a chapel in honor of Our Lady. But interestingly enough, he never mentioned the vision, right? He was single-mindedly devoted to carrying this out, but he didn't mention that he had had a vision, and Our Lady had specifically requested it. He would only tell them when he was at the point of death on April 27th, 1634, right? So they say that there's a great number of miracles that took place during the construction, right? So I believe it was the monk actually brought a statue with him, and they would try to bring it down to the parish church in Folgaria, and then 3 times it would miraculously be transported back to the chapel on the mountain. So they said, okay, we'll just leave it there. The monk himself, Pietro dal Dosso, was injured during construction, right? He actually had a finger cut off from his hand because like a rock fell on it. But miraculously, he was healed in a couple of hours. There was a child who was bit by a venomous serpent, and he was miraculously healed. And likewise, after a terrible, terrible snowstorm, it's interesting that the snow fell on the place, but it took the form of roses and lilies that were cut into the ice, and also of luminous stars. And the wind, which is probably howling, actually made melodious music. Interesting. And again, that's our Madonna della Grazia di Folgaria, the patroness of Italian skiers. And even if you're not Italian and you're a skier, I would take her as my patroness. For today's reading from the Imitation of Mary by Alexander de Rouville, we continue with Book 1, entitled Life and Virtues of the Blessed Virgin Mary, from her Immaculate Conception to the Birth of Jesus. And today we read Chapter 20, Fruit to be Derived from Communion for the Conduct of Our Lives. And again, we have a conversation between Mary and the believer. The believer. Mother of pure love, that comes from Sirach 24:24. You were entirely holy from the first moment of your existence. Yet, once the Word had taken flesh in your chaste womb, what new progress you made in holiness! The presence of Jesus within you for 9 months left in you impulses to holiness that would last all your life. The thought of the extraordinary favor God had bestowed on you kept alive in you to your last breath a holy concern for finding the means, and profiting by all the occasions, of expressing your gratitude to Him. Mary, my child, my example indeed ought to put you to shame. You receive in Holy Communion the all-holy God, yet you yourself are far from holy. A single communion should be enough to fill you with all the fervor of the saints, yet all your communions leave you as cold as you were before. You are always to some degree reserved in dealing with Jesus, although He does not hold back at all in heaping His blessings upon you. His presence when you have received Him indeed inspires in you great desires of virtue, and you promise Him much. But the desires and the promises soon fade. You would certainly not deal in this way with an important man of the world if he honored you with a visit. How aware are you of the gifts a friend gives you? How ready to thank him? Love cannot rest until it has found a way of expressing its gratitude. Can it be, my child, that you lack occasions for practicing virtue, such as the saints made use of after communion, when they wanted to show Jesus how sensible they were of the graces they had received? What He asks for you more than anything else is that you keep careful watch over your affections, so that they are all directed to Him. If you were to keep careful watch over yourself after receiving communion, you would retain the devotion you had at the time of communion. Such watchfulness after every communion is the best means you have of preparing for the next. The believer. Virgin, model of every virtue, I kneel at your feet, filled with shame at my coldness and ingratitude. Pray to Jesus for me that He will never come to my heart without directing all its movements and turning them entirely to Himself. May He take away this wretched heart of mine which is so unworthy of Him, and create in me a new heart. May He give me a heart like yours, ardent and generous, tender and constant towards Him, as your now is towards us.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed our Marian podcast. As St. John Paul II teaches us, from Mary we learn to love Christ, her Son, the Son of God. Through her intercession, may we grow ever closer to Him. We encourage you to share this with a loved one or friend and help spread our devotion to Mary. Thank you, and God bless.